Today I really wanted us to talk about Booker T. Washington because I feel like people like Manning Johnson or Booker T. Washington are often hidden
Mhm.
from Black education. We'll learn about Malcolm X, we'll learn about W.E.B. Du Bois, we'll learn about Martin Luther King, but Thomas Sowell or Booker T. Washington, Manning Johnson, these are people who we just don't hear about at all. I am learning about these people as a full grown adult at my big age. I thought my education was done, but here I am. So, Booker T. Washington lived from the mid 1850s, 1855,
Yeah.
56, until 1915. As a Black man born in the South, he was actually born into slavery. And he, lived all of his young life as a slave on a plantation with his mother. Then, come 1865 and the end of the Civil War and things like that, he is now released. But he couldn't read. One of his highest goals was to be able to read. And so when a teacher from the North ended up coming down and opening a school down in his general area, he did everything that he could to become a reader. And that
Yes.
led him through many different trials and paths, but eventually took him to Hampton and then to the founding of the Tuskegee Institute.
It's a remarkable story of someone born in slavery, gets emancipated at the end of the Civil War, and he just has this insatiable appetite to learn, to have knowledge, to be educated. He was not content where he was. He really had a desire to be something and be somebody.
His work ethic and his drive really were one thing. Like, I was so impressed by nothing's going to stop me. I have a vision, and as long as God has given me, breath in my lungs, I am going to work toward this end. I think what else I was struck by was really his approach to race. I have a couple of quotes that I want to read because a lot of the narrative that were sold is that there was no good relationships really between blacks and whites at the end of slavery.
Mhm.
And that even during slavery, blacks and whites had no good relationship. And that's not true. What Washington says is during the Civil War, one of my young masters was killed and two were severely wounded. I recall the feeling of sorrow which existed among the slaves when they heard of the death of Mars Billy, the young master. It was no sham sorrow, but real. Some of the slaves had nursed Mars Billy. Others had played with him when he was a child. Mars Billy had begged for mercy in the case of others when the overseer or master was thrashing them. The sorrow in the slave quarter was only second to that in the big house. When the two young masters were brought home wounded, the sympathy of the slaves was shown in many ways. They were just as anxious to assist in the nursing as the family relatives of the wounded. Some of the slaves would even beg for the privilege of sitting up at night to nurse their wounded masters. This tenderness and sympathy on the part of those held in bondage was a result of their kindly and generous nature. In order to defend and protect the women and children who were left on the plantations when the white males went to war, the slaves would have laid down their lives. The slave who was selected to sleep in the big house during the absence of the males was considered to have the place of honor. Anyone attempting to harm young mistress or old mistress during the night would have had to cross the dead body of the slave to do so.
Man, yeah. We look back on it now and we think of the some of the bitterness writings and things like that. But when you just think of some of those people, I mean, they were born on those plantations and that was their only situation they ever knew. And like he said, some of them had nursed the offspring of the slave masters, right? And so this kid, they basically raised them. There was this human connection. He said some others played with him, and then he had love for them, and didn't like to see when they got punished for whatever. Those types of things are human nature, regardless of the power dynamics of the relationship or whether slave and slave master. When people live together, grow together, like there's just this bond that is there. And it wasn't the full resentment. His mom cried when they got the news that their slavery had been emancipated. But it was just it's a mixed bag, right? Yes, they desire to be free, but they know the situation, just what the situation is. They didn't hate their white masters, and white masters didn't just hate their black slaves. It wasn't the contentious relationship the way we're painting it to be, like in Roots or something, you know?
Yeah. I don't doubt that there were slave masters who were horribly wicked. You know what
Absolutely.
I mean?
Yes.
100. But that doesn't mean that every slave master was. And the acknowledgement of that doesn't mean that we are condoning the institution of slavery. And Booker T talks about that as well. You know, that he doesn't have any ill feeling in his heart towards Southern whites, but that he also does not condone the institution of slavery. But he does understand that when a nation takes an institution like slavery and then puts it into their laws and into their economic structures and things like that, the need to fight for that is something that is great. And so reading his book to me just really showed all of the mix of what was happening at that time. Like he even mentions that at the end of slavery, there were a number of white slave owners who had lost all of their help on their plantation and they went into poverty. And the slaves, the ex slaves, would come back with food for the slave owners. We don't hear about this.
No.
Nicole
No.
Hannah Jones, Michael Eric Dyson, Cornel West. Like they're
Yeah.
not telling us this part. And I feel like if we're going to know history, it's important to know both sides of history. Yes, I can know the horrible parts, but we also need to have a understanding that like, hey, but there were some pieces to this, you know, this institution looked very, very different than what we're seeing right now. I want to read this other quote. I pity from the bottom of my heart any nation or body of people that is so unfortunate as to get entangled in the net of slavery. I have long since ceased to cherish any spirit of bitterness against the Southern white people on account of the enslavement of my race. No one section of our country was wholly responsible for its introduction. And besides, it was recognized and protected for years by the general government. Having once got its tentacles fastened onto the economic and social life of the Republic, it was no easy matter for the country to relieve itself of the institution. Then, when we rid ourselves of prejudice, of racial feeling, and look facts in the face, we must acknowledge that, notwithstanding the cruelty and moral wrong of slavery, the 10 million Negroes inhabiting this country who themselves or whose ancestors went through the school of American slavery are in a stronger and more hopeful condition materially, intellectually, morally, and religiously than is true of an equal number of Black people in any other portion of the globe. It just really goes back to what we talk about in like the providence of God. And is he condoning slavery? No.
Nope.
But to be a slave in America, at the end of the Civil War, it puts you as being in a better place than being a freed person in Africa.
Absolutely. And you used the word providence, and he used that word providence in the book. He had a strong understanding of the providence of God, and he realized that this is the situation that was dealt to us. He didn't blame any one person. He didn't have any bitterness. He said, it is what it is. And his whole point was moving forward from it. I could say he was also shaped by his reality. He was shaped by what he saw around him and the relationships he saw. Like I remember the one story he told about the one guy who had succumbed to alcoholism. And he's just a drunk, and they just pitied him. They basically took care of him, make sure he had what he needed because he was too pitiful to care for himself. And he was a white guy. And we're not told about those types of stories. We're just given Alex Haley's false interpretation in Roots.
Mm-hmm.
We're just told that it was all hatred and bitterness and cruelty. When reality is, we take a lot of those things that happen that, sure enough, some slave owners were really horrible and gruesome. But we take those and we make those stories like the whole. That's that's just what slavery was. It's like, no, that's what those slave owners were like. Because even from a Christian standpoint, you know, we talk about the Bible and people say it condones slavery and all this type of stuff. Whether it condones it or not, it definitely gives instructions of how you're supposed to treat them. There were a lot of people who were Christians who followed that, right? to treat their slaves well and do things like that. We just can't ignore all of that and paint it with one broad brush and picture.
Hey, if you enjoyed this content, come check out the Center for Biblical Unity. Download our free ebook, Is Christianity a White Man's Religion? Click on the link in the description below.